Board Talk is a weekly conversation to discuss diversity in the boardroom. Diversity as it pertains to corporate governance, as some of us know, is a hotly debated topic in business circles everywhere. And the question is why? And the simple answer is because, despite the fact that we know that diversity is good for boards, good for companies, it is predicted that at the current rate of change, it'll take about 30 years for boards to achieve gender parity. So we need to figure out how to change this, how to improve it, and to discuss and examine the issues surrounding the problem. Each week, I am welcoming a new expert and guest to discuss this topic from his or her experience and perspective. We're doing this series on the Mosh platform, and as you will see, Mosh is a new digital platform which allows you to engage and ask us questions, make comments real time from anywhere. So this week, I am so delighted to welcome Michelle Edkins. She is the Managing Director and Head of Global Investment Stewardship at BlackRock. And for the unfamiliar, BlackRock is a global investment management firm that manages, I read 12 trillion, 5 trillion, many trillions of dollars worldwide. Michelle is responsible for her team's engagement and proxy voting activities in relation to the companies in which BlackRock invests on behalf of their clients. And to do this, she has a team of 22 specialists based in 5 regions internationally. She also serves on her firm's Human Capital and Government Relations Steering Committee. She was named to the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors, Directorship 100 Governance Professionals list for the past 4 years. And she's also a fellow at the Aspen Institute's First Mover Program and a former chairman of the Board of Governors of the International Corporate Governance Network. She's a member of the steering committee of the U.S. chapter of the 30% Club, which is a market initiative to increase the number of women on boards and in senior management. And she's also an economist by training and originally from New Zealand. So I am so delighted to have you here. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. And I want to just jump right in with a very broad question. And that is about board diversity. You know, the discussion has moved from the why to the how, so we definitely know it's important and impactful and good for business. But the question is, how do we get there, and why is it taking so long?
Yes, thanks, and hello everybody. From our perspective, one of the reasons it's taken so long is that in the US in particular, for a long time, this was couched as a social justice issue or a fairness issue. And in that sense, the companies who were resistant to change pushed back on the basis that that is not what they're in business to achieve. The way that we are engaging companies around this is that we believe it's a matter of board quality and board effectiveness. Boards hold themselves out as decision-making bodies. There is plenty of academic evidence that demonstrates that more diverse groups take better decisions, particularly in complex and fast-changing environments. Now, I think most companies today would agree that that's exactly the environment in which they're operating, and that's why we think they should be aiming for diversity across multiple dimensions, but absolutely around visible diversity, and we can talk about that in a minute, meaning gender as well as ethnic and cultural diversity.
So I heard a quote, actually, I was reading, you said a guy from Yale and a guy from Harvard does not count as diversity, right? So it's all kinds of diversity. Can we talk a little bit about like the different types? I have, before we sort of jump into more detail on that and how we get there.
Sure. So, one of the other things you've seen, again, with companies that are resistant to change is that we all acknowledge that diversity of experience and expertise is what we're targeting. Absolutely. But that is not a person from Yale having some expertise and a person from Harvard having different expertise. It is people who have different life experiences because they live different lives. And In a business context, why that matters is, for instance, if you've spent a significant part of your career living and working in another country and you're serving on a US company board, that might shape your interpretation of certain situations that all of the Americans in the room would probably see through a very similar lens, even if they're different in and of themselves. And so that is the kind of diversity that we want to see companies demonstrate. And again, there is plenty of just anecdotal, life experience type of evidence that says men and women experience life differently. People of different cultures and different faiths experience life differently. And perhaps a woman who goes to Yale and a guy who go to Yale have a broadly similar experience, but they're probably still looking at things through a different lens. And so it's the homogeneity that we think is an issue and that we want to see boards address in terms of their makeup and their succession planning.
So what do we need to do? How do we actually, so we know it's good and we understand to some degree, some of us more than others, what diversity is, but how do we actually make it happen? How do we move this needle?
Well, I think each actor has to, fulfill the part of the play that they're responsible for. And that's a tangential way of saying, from an investor perspective, one of the things that we have been doing for the last few years is having the conversation with boards, particularly with nominating and governance committee members, saying, these are our expectations. Through our membership of the 30% Club in the US, we've also been promoting that at a very broad market level. This year, and very shortly, we are writing to the companies that have one or no women on their boards to say, we're really putting you on notice that we need to see a deliberate plan for how you're going to remedy this situation, or we will in future be voting against the members of the Nominating and Governance Committee. There's plenty of research out there and plenty of anecdotal evidence as well in it, and McKinsey have done a very good piece on this, that the most important thing you need to address the gap is deliberate action. And they, in the report that they did a year or so ago, they profiled several board chairs who had really dramatically increased the number of women on their boards, and it was about changing the mindset, changing the process for identifying candidates, particularly in terms of defining the characteristics needed, and then being deliberate, really being relentless about finding candidates who were going to be suitable. Sometimes it takes a bit longer, but if you're focused on it, you'll get there.
So in terms of these mechanics and ways of accomplishing this, a recent public company governance survey talked about, for example, expanding director search criteria. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts or comments? I've seen that happen, and it's no longer just the CEO, right?
Yes,
who's desirable. Yeah.
Exactly, and it's no longer someone who's already serving as a director. Everyone had to be a director for the first time at some stage in their career. And so if what you're looking for is someone with financial expertise and financial planning expertise, perhaps, don't say we need a CFO. Say we need someone with more than 10 years experience at a senior level of financial reporting and financial analysis expertise. Then you've got two different profiles. CFO is just shorthand for that other thing, but it automatically rules out a large number of people if you think you're looking for a CFO. The thing I do think is a slightly tangential point, having mentioned CFOs, I do think is really encouraging is the quite dramatic increase in the number of women CFOs in the US, and the realization that the role of the CFO is very strategic now. It is much more than being the financial accountant and financial analyst. And therefore, the skills that a CFO has and has developed over her career actually make her an ideal board candidate when that's the time in her career for doing that.
Absolutely, could not agree more. And there's also talk about, and I think this is interesting, diversifying the composition of the nominating and governance committee, because ultimately they're the starting point and often the ending point of the decision making.
That is absolutely right. And the natural human tendency, and we all do this, is to instantly feel more attracted to people who are like us. So if you have a diverse group on the Nominating and Governance Committee, you're more likely to have a diverse slate because the people who get on the slate are going to be like someone in that mix. The other thing that some very interesting research in the US it was done actually in Asia first, but in any case, published in the US, has identified is this issue of visible diversity and why that is important. Because most human behavior is very deeply instinctive. It comes from a very long time ago in human evolution. And when we interact with people who are different to us, who we can see are different to us, we are automatically going to be slightly more suspicious of their motives, slightly more critical of their arguments and their analysis, and we're also likely to prepare better for our own part of that conversation. And the reason is we're not presuming we see things the same way. And if you think about it, for any kind of decision-making body, that is what you want. You want people to be prepared. You want people to engage in pushing back on suggestions in a respectful way. And you want people to really, think through the merits of what's being said, not just whether you like the person or not. And so I think that is, a really important aspect of the gender diversity and the ethnic diversity.
Well, I think you take things less for granted when you're in a group of people, unlike yourself, which keeps you on your toes, right? Would you say that? I mean,
that's absolutely right. You don't presume you understand each other. In fact, you presume the other people are necessarily going to take a different approach to you, which means that you need to be willing to argue your point of view.
So I just wanted to circle back to what you said about having conversations with the boards and the companies that you're investing in or thinking about investing in, and the receptivity of the directors. It used to be back in the day, 15 years ago, the directors did not talk to anybody, outside of the boardroom, right? They were sort of kept behind the curtain. So how is that? And that brings up the issue of what is a qualification of the new directors, because if this is becoming part of what they do, how does that impact our director selection? Any sort of thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right that 10 years ago, it was very uncommon for board directors to meet with investors. And the financial crisis was a big catalyst in changing that behavior. And the interesting thing in our experience was that as more directors went out and met with investors and had that discussion, and they went off script and actually talked rather than briefed the investor, or talked to rather than brief the investor, they realized that actually the perspective that engaged investors can bring is different to things that they'll hear elsewhere, and that it can be insightful for them. And therefore, it can be valuable for the directors to have a different understanding of the way that the company is seen. That does mean, though, that directors may have to allocate more time to their roles. It does mean that they probably need to understand the investor universe better than maybe they had to in the past. And they definitely need to be mindful about their ability to represent the company. Now, when I say that, we are very clear in our engagements. We want to meet board directors to talk about issues that are in the board's control. So we will meet with management to talk about strategy implementation, risk management, those kinds of operational things. But we want to meet with board members to talk about things like succession planning for senior executive roles, succession planning for key board roles, board diversity, board evaluations. We can probably talk about board evaluation a bit more in a minute, because I think that's a key part of this. The other thing that we talk to board members, particularly nominating governance committee members, about a fair bit is the appropriate length of service of board members on a particular company's board. And again, the US is somewhat distinctive in that there is no market level term limit, as there is in practically every other market that we invest in on behalf of our clients. So we think it's interesting to talk to boards about how they see that issue.
Well, there's a lot, and I would love to talk about the board succession planning issue and what you're seeing in that area. I know that in this country, there is sort of this ego, and Fortune magazine mentioned this, there's an ego issue of stepping down from a board role. In other words, I think somehow it's a failure of some sort if you step out of the role. So we have a cultural mindset around this.
That's true, and this is where I think board evaluation is so important, because a thorough board evaluation process, not just a simple survey, but an interview-based, discussion-based board evaluation, probably every year, maybe every 2 years, depending on the board's agenda, is valuable when it's structured around who do we have on the board right now, and what skills and experience do they bring? Are there any gaps? Where is the strategy taking us? And what does that mean for the profiles of the directors we will no doubt need to bring in the near term? And in that framing, also talking to individual directors about where they think they contributed to the degree they would like to, where they fell short in their own minds, getting feedback from the chairman or the lead independent director, and making sure that it's an interactive feedback session about how the board and how individuals can perform better. It's always struck me as slightly peculiar that most of us get some form of performance feedback, if not daily, then certainly formally every 6 months or so. And then you get to your most senior pinnacle of your career, and suddenly there is no feedback. And yet a lot of the feedback that I have anecdotally heard directors say they've had through that process has been really helpful to them in being a better director. Because sometimes there's a mismatch between what the director thinks they're bringing to the board and what the nominating and governance committee or the chairman or lead independent director thought they were getting. And so someone might think they're there as a financial expert, for instance, but actually it's their experience in the European market that the board really finds the most valuable. And those things don't always align. And so through the evaluation process, hopefully that comes to the fore. But the other thing that comes to the fore is when someone is no longer the best fit for the group and for the strategy and the future of the company. And then it becomes a much more objective conversation. We really value the contribution you've made over the last 7 years or 10 years or 12 years. But we really believe that we need this board role or this board position for someone with a different profile, someone who has more of a profile around technology or whatever it might happen to be. And then it is much less that the individual is being victimized, if you like, or voted off the island in a sort of dramatic way, but just through this objective analysis, this is where we're taking the board and you are the least good fit for that. It's still not easy. And one of the large advisory firms, I think it was PwC, who does this annual board survey, has regularly shown that around a quarter to a third of directors believe someone on their board should step down, but they don't step down because no one will have the conversation. The conversation is hard. Making it more objective might make it a bit easier. But
yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, the number of times we've discussed this with lead independent directors or nominating and governance committee chairs, and it's a pretty even split whether they believe as the person in that board leadership role, they should have the courage to ask someone to step down. Or, on the other hand, it would make their life a lot easier if there was a term limit. And it's pretty evenly split.
So actually that I was going to say two things, but I did receive a question from somebody who's watching / listening. And the question is, do you think there should be term limits in the US?
I think we could waste a lot of time trying to get to a place where there's term limits in the US simply because it's difficult to see who has the jurisdiction to put it in place. That said, one of the things that we talk to companies about is, do they have an indicative term limit? Because a board, say a teenage clothing retailer, may have a very different business cycle and strategy cycle and CapEx cycle to an oil and gas major. So the ideal term for the apparel board may be sort of 7 to 10 years, where for the oil and gas company, it might be 12 to 15. But do they have that discussion when people come on the board? And that is, I think, the closest we're going to get to a term limit in US is boards setting an indicative term limit for themselves. And that's to manage expectations, and give the nominating and governance committee some leeway in being able to ask someone to step down even a little before the indicative term limit has come full term. But it also gives boards leeway when they have the perfect director for what they need at that point in time, and they can have that person stay on beyond the notional term limit because they're still contributing and they're still really the best fit for the role.
Right. It reminds me of what Jack Welch was so famously known to say, and he said a leader's, major skill can be knowing when to step aside. He was such a big proponent of succession planning and planning methodically with a bench. And I think it is important. You need to know, yourself. But, it brings me back to what you said earlier, in the prehistoric days of corporate governance, 10 years ago, whatever, board directors were beyond evaluation, right? You got into the boardroom and that was like the capstone of your career, and you no longer needed evaluation. So we've come a long way in a very short period of time.
But I think the other component of that, about knowing when to step down or being open to being asked to step down, also comes from that being a normal conversation inside the boardroom. Like, not every meeting, of course, but on a periodic basis. The other part of it is the board deliberately identifying a pipeline. Now, we often talk about this in terms of CEO succession planning, but in fact, in terms of board director succession planning, having a pipeline makes any unexpected or unplanned change much easier to manage. But it also keeps in mind of those who are incumbent that, they have to be reconfirmed every year. It is not a given that they will continue into perpetuity. The other thing I think is really valuable about having, a pipeline of potential candidates for board roles is that it is well observed that, made up statistic, 80% of board recruitment is done through the networks of the incumbent directors. In my view, that is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's just natural to say, these are the people I've come to know over the 30 plus years that I've been in this leadership, a leader in this profession. And I can vouch for these people. The main thing about using networks, though, is that each individual is deliberately trying to broaden their network and make it diverse. So that's down to the individual to act on that. And then in terms of creating a pipeline, drawing from each director's network some of the more diverse candidates, so you have that long list, if you like, and such that other board members can casually get to know them over time and so on, so that you have an idea about who is out there before you need to look for someone.
Absolutely. You don't want to wait to build the relationship when you absolutely need the relationship, right?
Exactly.
And I think it allows the organization to also go out to people who may not have the board experience that historically they said they needed. So we get to know them much better and we get much more comfortable with our decisions.
Yeah. And I think part of that is also about board leaders being a little bold in their choice from time to time. So maybe bringing in someone who isn't a traditional kind of board director profile, but also being willing then to spend the time helping them be successful in this new role. And in a sense, that is boards paying it forward. Someone did that for them. Someone helped them be a successful director. We didn't all get where we are today all by ourselves. And so boards committing to do that, and maybe only one first-time director at a time, because it probably is a bit of a workload on a couple of the board leaders and probably management. But the key part of that is you're adding to the pool of directors and probably being and able to tap on people with very different perspectives and backgrounds to who you might have on the board right now, particularly when it comes to where the economy is going. So it is around technology, it is around social media and marketing through social media. It is around millennials and how you make your company attractive both as an employer and a supplier to that segment of the economy. All of these things mean the average sort of 65 to 70-year-old director profile may need to get mixed up a bit. Not to say that these people are no longer going to be able to contribute, but we need to mix it up a bit.
Well, it's interesting because E&Y came out with their data this week, and they said the class, the Fortune 100 class of directors that came in this year, the average age was 58, and the outgoing group was 68.
Right.
So it's getting younger, So I'm trying to be mindful of time here, but have one question for you. Is there a case for setting a turnover target for boards? X number need to change each year.
I think that is something that investors assess when they look at a board in the round. How often is a new director added, and is it how spread across the spectrum is it that people are coming in and leaving? And by that I mean you do see boards where there is what we would call sort of an ossified component, where say 5 of them have been there together for 20 years. I'm sort of exaggerating a bit, but to make the point. And then all the turnover is in the under 10-year segment, because those directors come in, they're there for the first year learning and getting to know how the board works. And in the second or third year, they realize they haven't really got an opportunity to make an impact here because of the ossified component, and they leave. So the average turnover is fine, but the reality is something different. I think any of these kind of forced change prescriptions have they're going to get resisted by companies for a start, because they'll say it's a false reality. But secondly, I think you do run the risk that you have the appearance of good governance when really you don't. And so I think it's up to each investor and each board, to be clear, to really look and see, are people regularly stepping off who have served for a reasonable amount of time, they've made their contribution, and they recognize, or the board recognizes, that someone else is needed, and then someone new is coming in, and that is a really consistent and well thought through and well managed process, rather than something that's forced on the board by any kind of formula.
I love the use of the word ossified. I have to remember that one. So it is just about 1:30. I wanted to just ask you if you have any final words of wisdom for us on this topic, anything we didn't cover that you would like to mention.
The only thing I would add is, I think we all as women, and I'm assuming there are a lot of women on this call, need to be mindful about how we network as well, and be deliberate about networking with people who can make the introductions that expose us to people we wouldn't otherwise get to meet. Because one of the challenges, I think, is too many women network with women, but they don't go out of their comfort zone and network with the people, the lead independent directors, the nominating and governance committee chairs, who are actually the decision makers in these situations.
Very wise, sage advice, and I'm sure our listeners will appreciate that, because I think it's absolutely true. So thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience and your ideas with us, and really appreciate it. And we'll sign off.
Great. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.